We come now to the modern ethical philosophers. We're going to skip forward about 2,000 years to Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. Many people think the greatest, most important philosopher of the modern period. The modern period is usually taken to begin basically in the early 1600s, maybe late 1500s, and to extend, oddly enough, given the name modern, to about 100, 150 years ago. Sometimes it's called early modern, but either way, Kant is one of the most important philosophers of all time, and probably the most influential thing he ever did was develop his moral philosophy. So that's what we'll be taking a look at. I'm going to, in this video, give you a little background about Kant, including some of the changes in context from the ancient Greek thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, through to Kant himself. Okay, so he's born in 1724. He lives until 1804. What happened in Europe, since that's the part of the world we're really looking at here in this class, or that's the core of what's come to be known as Western civilization, because Europe goes on a conquering spree. In fact, the conquering spree from Europe has already begun. By 1724, Europe controls the entire Western Hemisphere. And pretty soon they're going to start looking at Africa and Asia, and they're going to start conquering that. So, but what's happened in the world since then? Well, lots of things. Too many things to mention. But there are two really important things for the purpose of understanding the differences in how Kant approaches ethics and how Plato and Aristotle approached ethics. And those two things can be summed up as Jesus and science. So what do I mean by Jesus and science change things? Well, of course, Jesus lives 300 years after Aristotle. And the reason why this is important is the spread of Christianity into Europe, reshaping Mediterranean culture and then eventually Northern European culture, which is how it gets to Kant. Why does that matter for ethics? Well, for one thing, there are quite a few ethical principles that come along with Christianity, but perhaps the most important thing is that egoism really ends up getting ruled out for most people. If you're raised in Christian religion, any one of the denominations, you're going to be taught an approach towards life, a way of understanding your place in the world that just makes egoism seem like a non-starter. Makes egoism seem like, rather than the basis of an ethical theory, the way it was for Plato and Aristotle, makes it seem rather like the fundamental sin, right? That it is something that is necessarily evil and wrong to think that you always have most reason to do what helps you. When you have a religion like Christianity, but the same thing goes for Judaism and Islam, you're asked to believe in a world where you exist because of a supreme deity. The Greeks did not believe in a supreme deity. Aristotle kind of did, but Aristotle also had the weird view that the supreme deity doesn't care about us or even think about us because we're beneath their notice. But Plato certainly doesn't have any room in his theory about how the universe works for a supreme deity. The closest he has is this thing called the demiurge, which designed the material world, patterned it after the forms, and then he took a hike and he's never coming back. Right? Plato was the original deist, someone who believed, well, something made the world, but it doesn't get involved anymore, so don't worry about it. Right? But if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, you think that you are in some very real sense, like barely even metaphorical sense, a child of God. You're supposed to have a personal relationship with God. You have duties to God. You owe everything, your life included, to God. And you are commanded in certain ways to look upon everyone else as a child of God who is loved by God and who has duties to God and things like that. And with a worldview like that, it's very difficult to sort of place yourself at the ethical center even of your own world. God is going to be at the ethical center of your world. And maybe second behind God would be the community of your fellow believers. And then after the community of your fellow believers might be humanity in general, all before it gets to you. So the rise of Christianity, the influence of Christianity on the culture in which Kant grew up, is part of the explanation for why Kant and our next author, Mill, are not going to take egoism seriously. They're not even going to really deal with it. They're not going to see that as, oh, this is an important thing to take account of, and let me argue against it. It's going to be for them like, well, egoism is what it is to be immoral, and I'm giving a theory about what it is to be moral. So that's out. And this, despite the fact that neither Kant nor Mill are Christians. Kant believed in God, but the God he believed in was not very much like the Christian God. Kant was raised Christian, certainly, but by the time he's an adult, he's putting himself at risk, actually, of going to prison because he refuses to attend church. He believes in a single deity. He doesn't, as far as I can tell from what I've read, believe that Jesus was a divine being. Kant is a theist, so he believes in God, but he is not a Christian. And Mill just isn't a theist at all. Mill doesn't believe God's real. Or at least everything he says in print seems to suggest that he doesn't think God is real. And certainly doesn't believe that Jesus was divine. Mill often compares Jesus to Socrates. I don't think he does it in the book. Oh no, he does do that a little bit in the book we're going to read from Mill. So, but despite the fact that they are not themselves Christians, and in Mill's case, not even a religious believer, they are still shaped by Christian attitudes because that formed the culture for both their cases for over 1,500 years. It shaped the culture of the place they lived. So you have Christianity altering the fundamental assumptions that these authors are bringing to their moral theory. And then there's science, the scientific revolution in particular. Now this, of course, comes much later than Jesus. There's a sense in which science is practiced before the rise of Christianity, because there's a sense in which Aristotle was a scientist. Aristotle did lots of biological work, some of which was actually right. Most of it was wrong, but some of it was right. Aristotle was doing astronomy and physics and all this sort of stuff like that. But the scientific revolution is when we normally think of science really getting going and the proper method for science being discovered. And here's one of the things that happens with the scientific revolution. The idea of objects behaving as they do because they have a natural purpose is ruled out successively. Now, by the time Kant's alive, there's one important field of science that sort of hasn't undergone a scientific revolution yet, and that's biology. It wouldn't do so until Darwin comes along. And it would be Darwin's work that removes talk of natural purposes or functions for living things, the way that physics and chemistry had removed natural purposes or functions for non-living things. And what this ends up doing is ruling out the particularly Aristotelian approach to ethics of saying everything has a function. What makes it good is fulfilling that function well. A function is kind of like a purpose, a thing you're supposed to be doing. And science is going to rule that out. Now, it's not going to rule it out entirely, but it's going to rule out the kind of purposes or functions that Aristotle believed in. Remember, Aristotle didn't believe that God gave things functions. He just thinks everything has a function. It's just what it is to be a thing. Everything's got a thing it's supposed to be doing. And what science rules out is that. What the modern scientific picture of the world says is, no, there's no purposes or functions. Everything moves the way it does what it does, behaves the way it does, because it was made to behave the way it does. Now that leaves open the view that God gives things functions, that God gives things purposes, in the same way that we give things we make purposes. So if you ask, like, why is this, what purpose or function does this phone have? I can answer that because this phone was made by people for a purpose. So it's not like people in the 1700s and 1800s didn't believe that things had a purpose. They just thought that that purpose if it existed, came from God, which is not what Plato and Aristotle would have thought. They did not believe that that purposes in nature or functions in nature were divinely ordained. But if you remember what I just told you about Kant and Mill, they don't believe in God, or Mill doesn't believe in God, and Kant doesn't believe in the God of Christianity by any stretch of the imagination. Then you're going to be able to see that the ordinary way of coming up with purposes for things that people even in their own time would have accepted, which is like, well, you know, there are purposes like the peasants have the purpose of growing food for the nobleman. The nobleman has a purpose of doing this, and priests have this purpose, and kings have this purpose. Men have one purpose, and women have another purpose. And the idea there was it was all divinely ordained. The idea is you could find in the Bible accounts of what everyone was supposed to be doing. For Kant and Mill, that's out. Mill because he's like, religion's mostly made up. And Kant because he's like, well, there's a God, but it's not the God that anyone actually worships. They're not going to rely, either of them, on natural purposes in nature, which means they're going to have to find a fundamentally different account of ethics than Aristotle did. Now, remember, keep in mind that Plato didn't have purposes playing a very big role, or functions playing a very big role in his approach to ethics, at least not explicitly. All right, so there are two differences that in sort of the intellectual and moral culture that our two modern authors sort of grow up in, and the intellectual moral culture that our two ancient authors grew up in. Kant specifically is, I mean, there's some interesting influences there. Kant's alive in the heyday of the scientific revolution. He's also alive in the early centuries of Protestantism in Germany. And he's raised as a pietist, so he eventually discards pietism. But if you want to know about the particular religious background of Kant, you can look up pietism. It's a fairly extreme kind of Protestantism. It's like Calvinism on steroids. But that's where he's coming from. What I'll talk about in the next video, which will hopefully be a short video, is what's going on in the preface of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, which is the book of Kant's we're going to be reading. It's not his only book on ethics. In fact, it's his shortest book on ethics and his most readable book on ethics, which is why I'm assigning it, which is why everyone assigns it. He has two much more substantial, much more difficult to understand books on ethics, The Critique of Practical Reason and the Metaphysics of Morals, as opposed to just the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. I will incorporate material from those where it's appropriate into discussing what's going on in this book, but you're not going to read it. All right, next video will be on the preface.